Hello, I'm Lou Pierozzi, and today we're going to be talking about the elements of three-dimensional design form. So what is form and how does it relate to three-dimensional design? Well, let's first begin to start to talk about it and then really kind of break it down into different ways to look at it. So we'll go ahead and start with the definition. So form defines what three-dimensional art is. It is that which occupies three-dimensional space. So what does that mean? Well, something that just has a physical presence, really. So whether it's a vase or a cup or a table, it has a physical presence. Another way we can think about it as a limited definition is form is the actual physical contour of a work, the volume or mass that it carves out of space. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at Tony Smith's piece. This is a great example of just clearly a form, right? It's very obvious. It's a 6-foot cube that's made out of steel, I believe. And so it just automatically tells you about its presence, right? It's this sort of massive thing. But, not all works are as obvious as this piece. So let's take a look at this piece. The form is almost non-existent since it's thin and occupies very little space and it's transparent. When we take a look at the last image that I showed you where it was the steel, that again, good physical presence that you get, but this, you can kind of see through it, right? It's not clear. It's laid out a little bit. You get a sense, but even this back area, it's hard to define. It's not as clearly defined as to what its physical form is. So again, it's a little bit less obvious. Now, one way we can break the element of 3D design form down is we can talk about it in a couple different ways. So one is external versus internal form. All right, external versus internal form. We normally think of forms as referring to the outside of a piece, its external form, but works may also reveal an internal form. Inner form, simply the reserve of the outer form of a hollow piece. Again, what does that mean? Well, let's kind of simplify this. So if we take a look at this piece, do you guys see where the exterior form is? It's the whole thing itself, but there's sort of a narrative of an internal form too, right? So when we look at this piece, it really reminds us of the ocean, right? And sort of how coral or life underneath the ocean works. And we assume that there's probably life inside these, or this doesn't end here. There's like little tubes in there, and there's this interior form that we may not be able to see it, but it's still there. So it appears as a colony of plants or animals kept in motion by the sea, right? We are given just enough information that it has an interior form as well. There might be tube carvers inside this place. All right, so that's how we can think about form, and that's how we can play with form in a couple different levels. This is Ewan Cole's work. I really love this. This is a great example of internal versus external form. So we understand the outside form. It's sort of this geometric shape with a minimal form, right? That's the external form. But we're a little bit more curious about the internal form. The window tells us there is an interior mystery opening. So if we look at this, right? Little window, we sort of know there's something going on in here. It's like when we take a look at a house and we look inside the window, we know there's a lot more going on inside there than that exterior form. Expresses a sense of sort of this unseen and unknown. So remember when we talked earlier about ways to involve the viewer? We want to draw people in. Well, that's what that little window does. It gets to start asking a lot of questions like what's going on, how is it revealed? So this small window-like opening, like a peephole window of a medieval castle, it suggests what? Like withdrawnness, mystery, entombment, illustration of revealing a hidden interior form, inner form, okay? This is Michelangelo's, one of Michelangelo's pieces. Now we're not, I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. On another level, sculptors often feel that they are removing excess stone from a block. They're revealing a form that was hidden inside long ago. It is not known whether Michelangelo intended to finish bringing the inner form out of this marble, or whether a piece of this is intended as a statement of the outer force, almost totally constraining the inner life and freedom of the human being. So again, here we kind of see, is the human figure, is it supposed to be like this? Are we supposed to remove more of it? Is it because it's headless? We're still trying to figure it out. So again, we get this sense of internal and external form sort of playing together within this piece. I love this. I think this is just a beautiful, I would love to have eggs delivered to me like this. So this is an egg package. Another expression of contrast between interior and exterior form appears in a piece in which one form is physically separated but contained within another. So if we take a look at this, there's really like two forms, but they're kind of one form. So we notice the eggs, right? That's kind of see that. But then we also see this casing on the outside. And when we visually look at it, we see them as separate things, but they're like together, right? They're kind of coming as a pair. If we take a look at this piece, sometimes we notice these effects when there are visual openings or transparent, okay? Or are transparent. Its contemporary counterpart. So we can notice this interior form here, which may be empty space, right? Obviously, it's very different from this external form. And so even though, again, they're kind of like that egg carton, they're one and the same, they're kind of separated in some ways. They have different elements going on, whether it's the interior or exterior. Another way we can think about form is primary and secondary contours. Primary contours is the shape of its outermost extremity, and its secondary contours is the forms that are developed on its surface. So what does that mean, right? Well, we can just make it real simple for you. External form, this, okay? So this is the primary contours, okay? That's the primary contours, and this is the secondary contours. It's on the surface when you take a look at it, okay? It really, so again, the primary contour is this cylindrical shape. Secondary contour is its surface, okay? What are the primary and secondary contours of this piece? Pretty obvious, right? So the primary is sort of this outside shape with these handles. I love this piece, by the way. And its secondary contours is the face and sort of some of these patterns that are created. That's the secondary contours. Now, moving in another direction when talking about form, see, isn't it really interesting? Like, we could just talk about form and then really sort of get to the nitty-gritty details of it. And there's so many different ways that we can take a look at form. And another way we can look at form is positive and negative form, which I love, seeing in a work personally. So positive forms are solid areas that occupy space. Again, what does that mean? Physical presence of an object is the easiest way to think about it. We'll show that in a second. And negative forms is the shape of space that are enclosed or delineated by positive forms. Easy way of thinking of it is the empty space that can be active and important in a piece as the positive form. All right, so let's just break this down a little more if you're a little bit confused. The positive form. What's the positive form here? Well, the positive form is this, the actual bronze casting, okay? What's the negative form? Well, it's this empty space and this empty space. Do you notice how it frames everything, but yet it's still, even though it's not there, it's hugely important to this piece. I like it. It's almost like like a picture frame. You've got this sculpture back there. One would take a look at that. I look at that and I start thinking, well, it's a little abstract, right? Maybe that's the eye of a pupil, and maybe that's the eye of a pupil. some weird way, right? Maybe the nose, maybe the face. You can use all of this environment into this piece. And again, we have two opposite forms here, but they're working in conjunction with one another. What is delineated space or delineated form compared to negative form? Delineated form or delineated space is enclosed. Okay, so you see how this is enclosed? That's delineated space. This is negative space or negative form. It's kind of all exposed, kind of can come in there, but this is enclosed. So that's your delineated space or delineated form. We can see the use of positive and negative forms and negative and positive forms in sort of this cathedral. So if we take a look at this, the negative space or negative form is activated by light. So it's all this, not necessarily empty space, but this we may want to read visually as kind of empty space, but this sort of activates this and becomes this really interesting use of light. Great example of it. Okay, now we're going to break down form in another way. We're going to talk about static and dynamic form. So what does that mean? What is static? Static appears stationary, non-moving. A lot of times people think static is boring, right? But it's not. You can really use static forms to really make some really interesting pieces. And so let's talk about that. So if we take a look at the Pyramid of Giza, I love using this as an example of what a great static form. So let me go ahead and read this. Because the base is much broader than the top, no inner force could conceivably cause this form to move or fall over. The piece seems silent, permanent, grounded in eternity, visually stable. Static doesn't mean boring, but rather speaks of strength, confidence, and power. And doesn't it? I mean, doesn't this piece, this is one of those wow moment pieces. Really, it's one of those things I really want to see in my own lifetime. What a great sense of grounded in eternity, right? Permanent silence, very powerful piece, but yet it's very static. This is not going to get and move away anytime soon. So, unless you're in some kind of conspiracy theory with the aliens, then maybe you have a different outlook on this. But I think for all intents and purposes, we're just going to say this isn't going to go anywhere. I got a chance to see the terracotta soldiers in China, and it was a very moving thing to see. I mean, it's like this giant football field covered. I wasn't able to take any pictures there. We weren't allowed to film at that time. But let's talk about this. These forms are static, non-moving, and they speak of strength. They were created, I think, in 215 BC. And if we look at it, if you look at each shape, their legs aren't bending, they're not moving, they're very static. They are not going anywhere. But you get a sense, you don't want to mess with these guys either, right? The emperor buried them with him for the afterlife. And not only did they have full-size horses out of terracotta clay, but they had full-size horses, which were absolutely massive. It was really neat. But again, if we look at each one of these visual figures, straight-armed, straight legs, they're not going anyway. They are positioned to do something, but not at this time. Again, you can kind of see that. Each one of these had different heads too, so that was kind of fascinating. All right, let's talk about dynamic form. So we talked a little bit about that figurative thing. We get a sense for those being not moving, but dynamics, forms that are characterized by motion, change, or energy that will lead to motion and change. What does that mean? Well, what that means is, take a look at this roller coaster. Now, this isn't necessarily a piece of art, but we get a sense that in a moment later, this is going to be changing. These folks are going to be rip-roaring down this roller coaster, and everything's going to be moving in a second. And in this particular photograph, that's going to happen, right? But we can make artwork that looks like it's moving, although it's probably never going to go anywhere. And this is a great example of that, right? This feels like a second from now, it's going to be moving. So it's very dynamic. We get that good sense of motion. Again, it looks like a person, sort of abstract or stylized. And again, in a second later, it's going to be moving in another direction. How about that? Again, these guys aren't, these two women aren't going anywhere, but yet we get a sense that they're moving. I love the engaging curiosity that's presented here as well. Just some really interesting stuff. But do you guys see why I would say there's a sense of movement here, right? These squiggly lines. That's a great way if you want to add, or these diagonal lines, which we sort of talked about last time. They set up all that sense of motion. Here's a non-representational piece. Again, it feels like a fan. It feels like it's moving. How is that happening? Visually, because of these diagonal lines. Okay. The other thing that's really interesting, do you see the delineated space? Or you could even argue negative space, but I think that the ground sort of makes a delineated space here. It frames the city behind it really beautifully, right? Okay, so there you have it. That is the lecture on the elements of 3D design relating to form. I hope you enjoyed the PowerPoint presentation and have a great day.